This morning, President Trump and the First Lady went to St. John Paul II's National Shrine in Washington, D.C., where they laid a wreath and observed a moment of silence. Last night, the president, of course, stood in front of St. John's Episcopal Church holding a Bible for a brief photo op, but without any notice to the church or to the diocese. Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest and editor-at-large of America, a Catholic magazine, tweeted, "Let me be clear, this is revolting. The Bible is not a prop. A church is not a photo op. Religion is not a political tool. God is not your plaything." Father James Martin is the editor-at-large of America, a Catholic magazine, and Reverend Marion Buddy, Bishop of Washington, D.C., and they both join me now. Thanks so much. Father Martin, first to you. I presume that the president's trip to the shrine of St. John Paul II was pre-approved, that the church, the Catholic Archdiocese, was well aware of that.
Well, apparently not, because the Archbishop of Washington, Archbishop Wilton Gregory, this morning, just condemned it as baffling and reprehensible, and saying that it was amazing to him that a shrine would be used in that way, and that a religious site would be manipulated in that way. And so he clearly thought of it in the same way that, that the bishop, the Episcopal bishop, objected to the use of her church, or the diocese's church, as a photo op. And so I sometimes wonder, does he know what John Paul stood for? Does he know that this is a pope who actually worked with protesters during the Solidarity movement in Poland? Does he know that Jesus talks about blessed are the peacemakers? So these are apparently just photo ops where he's using religion and religious imagery to bolster his political situation.
And Father, I apologize because I assumed, since it was on his schedule, unlike what he did last night, that this had been worked out with the Archdiocese. And I have to confess to being shocked by that. I should have known. That is my error. To Bishop Buddy, I listened to you last night when you first expressed your outrage. Let's talk about what happened at St. John's, which took all of us, and certainly a lot of the peaceful protesters who were cleared from Lafayette Square with no notice before the curfew had even taken place, which Mayor Bowser has objected to as well.
Right. I mean, it's the entire scenario, starting from his very worrisome militaristic remarks at the Rose Garden, threatening military force to any state that he doesn't deem adequately responding to the protests, then having the park and the front of the church courtyard cleared with tear gas and officers in riot gear, and then standing before the church holding our sacred texts as if they were symbols that he could appropriate to bolster his, or to vindicate or to authorize his political and statements and positions. And we just felt, the real outrage is what's happened in our country. The real outrage is the racial violence that has been perpetrated against people of color for generations. But to use the symbols and the sacred spaces of our tradition to justify or to bolster his positions were something that we had to address immediately and disassociate ourselves from completely.
And Father Martin, you were certainly very active last night speaking out. Tell me more about the Archdiocese's position and why it is so deeply offensive to you to have Pope John Paul II's legacy, his spiritual legacy, used in this political fashion.
Well, I think, as the bishop was saying, to have anyone's spiritual house of worship or legacy used in that way is really reprehensible. The Archdiocese of Washington condemned it today. The shrine is owned by the Knights of Columbus, so it's separately operated. But I would just say that to look at someone like John Paul, who stood up and said racism is a sin. I found a quote from him from 2001 where he said, "Love for one's country is a value, but it can turn into," listen to this, "self-exaltation, the rejection of diversity, and forms of nationalism, racism, and xenophobia." So in other words, what's being proclaimed by the actions of the president is in direct opposition to what St. John Paul had talked about. And so again, these symbols are being used for political purposes. And I found that last night, holding up the Bible, after you've dispersed a crowd of peaceful protesters with tear gas, to go there and to say that we have the greatest country in the world while holding up a Bible, I thought was pretty much antithetical to everything Jesus stood for.
I agree. Absolutely
And
agree.
of course, go ahead, Bishop.
No, it's everything that the Bible teaches about love of neighbor, love of God, striving for justice, respecting the dignity of all people, was used in a calculated way, to say that God was in some way favoring or supporting a position that is antithetical to the teachings of Jesus and to the God revealed in both the Hebrew, the Jewish, and the Christian tradition.
And St. John Paul II, St. John Paul, of course, was not only the leader of Solidarity, but I know his ministries here when he was in Denver. I remember covering him as well as Denver as well when he was on his way to South Korea for the youth ministry. What he represented in every way, Father Martin, was so different from what we are seeing today.
Absolutely. The church has what's called the preferential option for the poor. Pope St. Paul VI, John Paul's predecessor, said, if you want peace, work for justice. So as Bishop Buddy was saying, it's not simply about standing with the poor and the marginalized, as Jesus did. It's addressing the systems that keep them poor and marginalized. And this is said over and over by St. John Paul II, I think in words that we forget, and to use him and his legacy and the church and the Bible and Jesus as a prop without understanding what their messages were is, I think, complete hypocrisy.
I would also like to say,
Bishop Buddy, is there anything the community can... Go ahead.
Yes, speaking to the community, speaking to our nation, speaking to rising generations who are looking for hope, for a possibility of real reform and real change. That one of the things that I think both Father Martin and I agree is that we believe that our spiritual communities and spiritual institutions are on the side of that movement and on that dream for justice and equality and dignity. And that is where we are called, and that is where we will stand.